I've already mentioned how that Henry Clay worked up two compromises, one in 1820, the other 1832. In 1850, there was another compromise that needed to be worked out. Particularly when California asked to come into the Union as a free state. Well, California was mostly below the line and should have come in as a slave state. But the people who came into California were overwhelming. Again, keep in mind, most of your people lived in the north. And the people who moved into California were overwhelmingly anti-slave. So they worked up a compromise to where California would be admitted as a as a free state. California given as a free state. And this meant that for the first time in history, the tie in the Senate was broken. And if you recall, each state sends 2 senators. There are now more free states than slaves. But the South did get something. The South got the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that any slave that ran away was to be returned to its owner. That was a fugitive slave law. And President Millard Fillmore carried out that law because he felt like he should. Franklin Pierce also carried it out, the next president for Fillmore, and so did Buchanan. The next 3 presidents enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, and basically they tried to return. Now, what this meant was that a lot of slaves went all the way to Canada, which was a free territory. And you had a lot of slaves went from Canada to Great Britain. Canada has never had the problem with race that the United States has, neither has Great Britain. But the United States still has a problem to this very day, in this very hour, in this very moment. Still has the problem. Anyway, there was a feature called the Underground Railroad. Now, it was neither a railroad nor was it underground. The Underground Railroad was a way that slaves were carried off of plantations and sneaked up to the north, where they were eventually sent to Canada. Now, if you go to Ohio, and of course I'm from Ohio, you'll find several what they call Underground Railroad stations, where these slaves would be hidden inside, maybe inside barns or inside silos in the daytime, and at night they'd be transported to the next station. Now, Wild Bill Hickok's father was a worker, you might say, on the Underground Railroad. Wild Bill Hickok's father would transport slaves from his farm to the next farm. And he'd do this almost every other night or so. Well, not every night, but he'd receive the slaves from a neighboring farm one night, and the next night he'd transport these slaves to another farm with the intent that eventually get to Canada. Now, Wild Bill himself, when the Civil War broke out, he said he had no doubts which side he was on, because he could remember the terrified the terrified looks he saw on the faces of the Black Americans who were being freed from slavery. So he was obviously going to be on the northern side to begin with. Some of the chief slave freers were women like Harriet Tubman. Oh yeah, and Grandma Moses. Now I've got to ask you something. The slave's favorite Bible character was Moses. Can anybody tell me why? Yes?
He led the slaves out?
Moses led the slaves out of Egypt. Yeah, thank you. Moses was the one. So when the slaves read their Bibles, they would read about Moses. And now that Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh wouldn't do it. And God sent plagues on Egyptians, and Pharaoh still wouldn't do it. And finally, after 10 plagues, Pharaoh said, "Well, get out of my sight, I don't want to see it anymore." So basically, Moses freed the slave with Grandma Moses. Now, Grandma Moses would appear at a camp, and she carried a Colt 45 with her, loaded. And it was known that when she came into your camp, when the slaves would be gathered around a campfire, maybe singing hymns or holding religious service or telling stories to each other. They did this a lot. But then at the end of the camp would appear Grandma Moses, and every slave knew they're going with her whether they want to or with her, she's going to pull out a revolver and shoot you.
That's it.
Because see, if she didn't shoot you, you're going to go tell old Massa. Oh yeah, you know about it. You're going to tell old Massa. And now, the southern slave owners tried hard to catch Grandma Moses, and some of you know they never did. They tried hard to, Harriet Tubman did the same thing. They tried hard to catch Harriet Tubman, and never did. Both women got away with it year in and year out. They would sneak slaves out of slavery and into the north. And the ones that went to Canada, of course, the government could do nothing about those. The ones that didn't leave the country, some of them were returned to their masters. Again, folk, not to be opening old wounds, but I don't think we should sweep this under the rug, because it is a big part of our history. All right. There was a book written at this time, a very famous book. It was the most sold book except for the Bible in the late 1800s. The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Written by a woman whose, I believe, her father had been a slave owner. Anyway, she turned against slavery. Now, there are persons who have criticized this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, as being exaggerated. But others will say that, no, she was giving, the woman who wrote Harriet Beecher Stowe, some say that she was giving an accurate description of what life was really like for the slave. The chief character in the story was a slave named Uncle Tom, a devout Christian man, but who was forced into slavery by circumstances he could not control. And how that Uncle Tom was terribly mistreated by his masters, and the other slaves were being terribly mistreated also. This did a lot to stir up popular sentiment. Now, if you could go back in time and visit the United States in 1850, you would have found that most of the country did not have any opinions on slavery one way or another. The Northerners just say, yeah, it is, and we don't do it here, but it's okay if they do it. But by 1860, just 10 years later, the country became what we call polarized. The persons who were for it were really for it, and the persons who were against it were hard against it. So the country became polarized over the issue, and the issue was eventually to lead to war. Well, now, what's that?
Uncle Frank?
Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom. Yeah. The name Uncle Tom, when President Bush nominated Clarence Thomas Supreme Court, they called him Clarence Thomas Uncle Tom. For whatever reason, I don't know. They also called them Oreo. If you know about Oreo cookies, they're black on the outside, white on the inside. Clarence Thomas is actually white. Yeah. Anyway. Uncle Tom. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had two territories, the territory of Kansas and the territory of Nebraska. It was designed to meant that Kansas would come into the Union. Kansas was south of Nebraska. Nebraska would come in as a free state and Kansas a slave, but it also had a very, very ulterior motive, was to push the Indians out of both territories, even though Andrew Jackson promised the white man would never encroach on those territories. The idea was to push the Indians so that the white men could move in and take over those territories and keep pushing Indians out. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act did a lot to stir up a lot of trouble, because it led to what they called Bleeding Kansas, where bunch of people on both sides began killing each other, and one of them was John Brown. John Brown went to Pottawatomie Creek, don't write that down, and killed about 5 slave owners. And a man named Beecher sent some rifles to help the anti-slave people. Beecher was from Massachusetts, and they called these rifles Beecher's Bibles. I mean, comparing rifles to Bibles. But the purpose of the Bibles was to kill slave owners. All right. Now, in 1856, for the first time a new party came in, the Republican Party. The Republican Party started out as it remained a party for the rich, that's true. But it also started out as an anti-slave party. Now there had been another anti-slave party before, the Free Soil Party, but the Free Soil Party did not get off the ground. But the Republican Party was here to stay. The Republican Party was an anti-slave party, so the Democrat Party became the party of slavery. In 1856, though, the election went to the Democrats. James Buchanan became president. And the first Republican candidate was John C. Fremont. Now, I say this because the second Republican candidate was Abraham Lincoln. All right, this issue of slavery got heated up, got hotter and hotter, made even more so. All right, there came another party on the scene too, the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings were a secret society. The Know-Nothings were anti-foreign and especially anti-Catholic. I mean, folks, now I want to say this about the anti-Catholic sentiment. It's part of our history, just like slavery, it's there. In no way do I mean to promote anti-Catholicism, you understand? Nevertheless, when I say the Know-Nothings were anti-Catholic, that's a historical fact, and I don't want to scoop it on the rug. So, but in no way am I promoting any kind of anti-Catholic sentiment or anti-Catholicism. But the Know-Nothings did. That's a fact. So the Know-Nothings were anti-Catholic, and they got the name because every time somebody outside asked, well, what do you believe? They'd say, I know nothing. I know nothing. As they got the name Know-Nothings, because they wouldn't tell what went on. They'd hold their meetings in secret, just like the lodges. But it is known that they were strongly anti-foreigner. They did not want immigrants to come in. And folks, this is an issue in 2018. A lot of these issues that we have today, they dealt with it then. They did not want new immigrants, and they did not want Catholics to come in. They were anti-Catholic. Anyway, they came in, but they did. Then the Republicans came in also, and they were anti-slave, and they took the place of the old Whig Party. The Whig Party died after the 1848 election. The Whig Party died. So in 1856, 8 years later, the Republicans. Most of the Republicans were made up of former Whigs. Abe Lincoln had been a Whig, but when the Whig Party died, he became a Republican. Now, we had 3 presidents during the 1850s, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. I'm not going to write their names down, but I want to know this about all 3 of them. The presidents were all 3 of them Northern men who had Southern sympathies. In other words, I'll write them down. Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan. Now the purpose of this was to try somehow to appease both sides. Now with Fillmore, he was a Northerner. Okay, that would get the Northern vote, but he talked like a Southerner, so I get the Southern vote. Pierce, same thing. Northern man with Southern leanings. Buchanan, again, Northern man with Southern leanings. With Abe Lincoln, for the first time in history, you had a man who was a truly Northern man without Southern leanings. And anyway, that's jumping ahead of the story. Abraham Lincoln was a Northern man with without Southern leanings, without Southern sympathies. These other men were northern men. That was to get the north votes. Again, it got to where only a northern man could be elected because, after all, the north had so many more people than the south. And this is what you know, because this is one reason why the Civil War went the way it did. The north greatly outnumbered the south.
So were these three, were they Democrats or Republicans? Or
All right, this one, he was a Whig. He was a Democrat, he was a Democrat. This man did not get the nomination from his own party, partly he spent his time doing. Well, on his way to the White House, the wagon he was in toppled over and his one son was killed. And he never recovered from that. His son was killed on his way to White House. Also, his wife never did like Washington living to begin with, and all of a sudden his wife found herself being first lady, and she hated it. Now, Buchanan, he's unique, and he's the only bachelor president we ever had. Never married, so while he was president, his sister served as first lady. Something else about Buchanan, too. The United States and Great Britain made peace with each other. They quit their quarrels, and Queen Victoria sent 2 of her daughters to Washington on a goodwill trip. But as they were arriving, Washington was in a frenzy. Where do we have that's capable of housing royalty? These girls are used to living in a palace. And they finally said the only place we have where we can keep these girls is the president's own private bedroom. So they moved James Buchanan, but James Buchanan really moved and stepped out in the shed while these girls occupied his room in the White House, because in those days Washington did not have any rooms that were nice enough for royalty. So these 2 royal girls slept in the president's house, the president's bedroom, while the president slept outside in an outbuilding. This was during the summertime, of course. But this was kept really, really secret for a long time. We eventually found out. But anyway, Buchanan was the only bachelor president we ever had. Now, in his inaugural address, James Buchanan said, "I hope that the Supreme Court is going to decide the British issue one way or another." Now, folks, the Supreme Court is making a lot of news, and I didn't say this before, but I don't think our founding fathers ever intended the Supreme Court to have the power that they have. They usurped it. The Supreme Court is not given the power of judicial review in the Constitution, nor is it in the Federalist Papers. But the Supreme Court usurped this power. Just basically, they went in, they took it. They went there, so they usurped it. Anyway, the Supreme Court made the worst decision ever made about this time. A slave named Dred Scott. Now, Dred Scott had been born a slave in Missouri, but his master took him up to Minnesota to live, which was a territory. Minnesota was not a state yet. Minnesota was a territory. They wouldn't let Minnesota in as a state because it would obviously be a free state. But anyway, Minnesota was a free territory. So Dred Scott lived in this free territory. Then his master moved to Illinois, taking Dred Scott with him. Dred Scott moved to Illinois, a free state. So Dred Scott, a bunch of lawyers got together and said, "We know he can't afford the case, but let's us take this case to court and see if we can't get him freed." So Dred Scott said, "Because I lived in a free territory and then I lived in a free state, I should be a free man. Because when I lived in Illinois, Illinois was an anti-slave state, so I should have been freed." The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And here's one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever made. The Supreme Court ruled that residence in a free territory did not make a slave free. All right, here's what this meant for them. This meant that any factory owner in the North could have gone south and purchased a bunch of slaves and brought them up and worked them in his factory, because they said, they pointed to the Constitution, it is in the Constitution, that a document that is issued in one state must be binding in another. What this means is if you get a marriage license in the state of Georgia, this marriage license must be recognized as valid in the state of Kentucky. Or if you have a gun, that does not necessarily apply to gun permits, but if you get a gun permit in the state of Georgia, unfortunately, it does not always apply in every state. All right, but anyway, they said if a man is a slave in one state, he's a slave in every state. Then they went on further and said that Congress had no right to declare some states slave and some states free. Therefore, all the compromises that had been worked out were unconstitutional, which meant that any state, anybody could make a slave of a black man. All the compromises, all the laws against slavery in all the northern states were unconstitutional. The purpose of it was to try to end the agitation over slavery. It had just the opposite effect. Within 4 years, the Dred Scott decision was issued in 1857, and within 4 years, the North and South were shooting at each other. Nothing stirred up more hatred. The North began to hate the South, and the South the North worse than ever. Now, Chief Justice Taney, Roger B. Taney, said this, and I want to quote, this is him. He was a Southerner. He said, "The black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect." Quote, end quote. Now, folks, again, you understand, I'm not teaching this. This is what he said. I could not agree with it less. Again, worst decision in all of history. Yes?
What arose the hatred between the North and the South?
The hatred was your northern people did not want slavery. Especially since, if you were a northern factory worker, and my dad was for a while, but this was way after this time. If you were a northern factory and struggling to make ends meet, if a slave came in and worked for nothing but a little bit of food and a little bit of clothing, you couldn't compete with that. Well, the northern factory worker would fire you. Hey, I got a bunch of slaves to do my work down in this factory. You white people, you go out. That was part of it. But the other thing, the northern people started to believe less and less in slavery, especially after the book Uncle Tom's Cabin got a lot of northern people moved to tears over the treatment of the black slaves.
But that was a book.
There was a book, yeah. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book. That's why I wrote it in cursive writing, because it's italic. And if you wrote it out, it should be italicized. It's italics. Anyway, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Nothing worse could have come than the Dred Scott decision as far as stirring up hatred on both sides. Well, sure, the year after that, in 1858, two men were running for Senate in Illinois. Now, keep in mind, in those days, senators were voted by the state legislature. The common people didn't vote. Abraham Lincoln was running against his old friend Stephen Douglas, both of whom had once competed for the same woman. Now they were competing for the same Senate seat. Abraham Lincoln would follow Douglas where Douglas went. Douglas would go around. All right, now I want to say this about a race. Now, if you're running a foot race, and if you're in the lead, you've got one big disadvantage being in the lead. You don't dare turn around and see where your opponents are. Now, do you have any? Why don't you turn around? Anybody know? If you're running a foot race and you turn to see where your opponents are,
That was actually like
you're going to slow yourself down. You'll slow down. You can. Every champion runner knows this. You're running to the finish line. You don't know where your other contestants are. Now they know where you are because you're between them and going. Well, Douglas was ahead. Lincoln was behind. Okay. Lincoln had the advantage. Then Douglas threw up. Anyway, basically, if the election had been voted on by the people of Illinois, it's likely Lincoln won. Douglas would go to a town. He was a little man. He'd stand on a stump and make a speech. Lincoln would be off in the distance listening to the speech, but out of sight. And as soon as Douglas left, Lincoln would step up. Okay, everybody, here I am. Gather around. Listen to what I have to say. And he would refute what Douglas had said. Finally, Douglas got there, so Douglas said, hey, why don't the two of us meet face to face? So they had the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates where they debated slavery. Douglas was trying to say that slavery should be decided on by each, it is called the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Each territory should decide it for himself. Douglas. Popular sovereignty Well, the problem with that doctrine was it went against the Dred Scott decision. Abe Lincoln, on the other hand, had no love for the Dred Scott decision, didn't feel like he had to agree with it. Douglas could not go against it. Well, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were put out in every newspaper in the country. Lincoln said this, Lincoln said that, Lincoln did this, Douglas said that, Douglas said this, Lincoln said that. And Lincoln then got known by everybody in the country. This was to lead to Lincoln becoming president 2 years later. To make a long story short, Douglas won the election by only 8 votes in the Illinois legislature. So Douglas went to the Senate, and Lincoln went home feeling like, I lost, I'm a failure. Within 3 years, Douglas was to say, I'm a failure. Lincoln was president of the United States. All right. The Union started to collapse. This takes us up now to 1860. The most important election in history up to that time. Here's the way it went, folk. In the election of 1860, you had the convention, so the Democrats met in the convention, the Republicans met in the convention. The Republicans met first, and they nominated Abraham Lincoln. So you have on the Republican side, Lincoln. Now, the Democrats nominated 3 different candidates. Douglas, let's see, my memory's starting to fail me. Douglas, Breckinridge of Kentucky. Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. Okay, yeah. Basically, the Democrats nominated Douglas. Don't worry about these names because I couldn't even remember. Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. Now, here's what happened. The Democrats split their vote. They first went with Douglas, and a bunch of the Southern delegates said, we're not going to have Douglas. So they put up Breckinridge. When the Democrats saw, hey, we're divided, so let's unite, let's pick another man so we can unite behind him. So they picked another man, they could unite the party. Instead, the party became worse than ever. So basically, the Democrats split their vote. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote, but you all know the rules, I hope. It's the man or woman who gets the most votes in the Electoral College who gets it. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote. And keep in mind, over a lot of southern states, Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot. Now, before the election, what I want you to know too is, for the first, about the second or third time in history, the telegraph was in widespread use. And this meant that the election results were going to be known quicker than they would have before. It was not quite like it is in today's world of computers, you understand? But nevertheless, they at least had the telegraph, which 30 years before they hadn't even had that. But the telegraph, it was instant. Well, anyway, South Carolina, the state has said, if you don't play ball my way, I'm going to take my ball and bat and go home. South Carolina said, if Lincoln is elected, we're going to leave the Union. I have a brother who moved to South Carolina, and he has been taught that the South Carolinians understood at the beginning they could leave anytime they wanted to. Whatever, they tried it. Anyway, the South Carolina people waited until the the South Carolina legislature waited to determine the outcome of the election. It took a few days. The votes were not counted as fast, and not every precinct had a telegraph. But the results came in, and after several days, it wasn't like today's election where we know within a few hours. After several days, it was obvious Lincoln had won the election overwhelmingly. In the Electoral College, he won. Well, South Carolina then balked a little bit. They were somewhat hesitant. Now, wait, do we really want to leave or not? And they hesitated. And finally, though, when they got with other states and learned that other states were going to leave the Union, South Carolina finally left the Union. So South Carolina left first. Followed by North Carolina, followed by, now here's the story of Georgia, folk, and this is written on the Stone Mountain Monument. They took a vote in Georgia whether to leave or stay, and the vote was something like 51% to stay and 49% to leave. But the power that be, the higher ups in Georgia said, we don't care what the people said, we're going to leave anyway. And they forced Georgia out of the Union. This is what you can read on one of the monuments in Stone Mountain. Anyway, Georgia left. After all, Georgia would not have been comfortable being the only southern state